Let's come to the boundary question, Ambassador Rao. This remains as one of the major challenges for India and China. Why have the two sides not been able to finalize a deal on the boundary question? I'm told people say that we know what to do, both sides know what to do, what give and take needs to be done. But why is that the two political leaders, and they are very strong political leaders at this point of time, Mr. Xi and Mr. Modi, why have they not been able to make a deal, make a final deal on the boundary question?
Whatever be the case, I mean, if and when you have a solution to the boundary question, the settlement, it has to be a political level settlement, and it has to involve a degree of give and take between the two sides. And I think neither side is willing at this moment for that give and take. And it has nothing to do with just now. It has been like that probably from the beginning, except that there is an impression, there is a kind of a persistent view that maybe the Chinese were ready for a swap in the 1950s, when Premier Chou En-lai and Prime Minister Nehru had their confabulations. Right. But when push comes to shove, we really don't know how the Chinese would have reacted, if we had really had to sign on the dotted line on a deal that involved that kind of quote-unquote swap. We were not ready for it at that time. We were not prepared because, the whole build-up of the public perception of what this boundary problem involved was centered very much at that time on the Aksai Chin area in Ladakh and the Chinese occupation, the Chinese aggression into that area. The eastern sector of the border, which is defined by the McMahon line, what is today Arunachal Pradesh, we knew, of course, that the Chinese had questions about the McMahon line, but the impression at that time was that they were somehow prepared to accept the realities there. They didn't want to disturb what had come about post, soon after independence, or liberation, what the status was. I think views were still being formed at that stage. But 30 years down the line, by 1985, the Chinese had made it very clear that the eastern sector, the Arunachal Pradesh sector, was the sector of the largest dispute, and that India would have to make concessions there if China was being asked to make concessions in the western sector. So, for the last 34 years, that's where it has stood.
So what was the nature of the conversations when you were the Foreign Secretary and before that when you were the Ambassador to China? Was there the broad contours of a deal that we could have worked out?
I really can't say, and I don't think it would be fair for me to say that a contours of the deal many ideas have been floated, and this is a problem that has been discussed threadbare outside the government also. I think there numerous theories have been floated, but the point is that let's take India, a democracy, constitutionally defined limits, our maps are all in place. You can't really alter boundaries so easily. No government can do it, especially a democratically elected government. So when you're thinking of a border settlement, you must understand why it's taken so long is that it is so complicated and so complex. So the best way is to build confidence between the two sides to ensure that problems don't get out of hand. And that's how you have all the 6-7 confidence building agreements that have ensued since 1992-93. And that has kept the peace on the border, which I think is no mean achievement. But the lack of a boundary settlement certainly, I think, is there. It's at the heart of the relationship, it's at the core of the relationship. And we've tried to build structures around it. We've tried to sort of kind of quarantine it. But how long do we keep it in quarantine?
How is China's rise perceived in the West as a major threat or as an opportunity? For instance, within NATO or even in Canada, for that matter, how is China perceived? China's rise is perceived.
It's both, and people don't quite know what to make of it, or how to analyze it, or how to come to grips with it. It is going to be a different sort of a power in many ways. In some ways it'll be the same. The Chinese, in some ways, have a very old sense of nationalism, a 19th sense of what it means to of nationalism. So in some ways it's a throwback, in other ways it's new. I'm not sure I buy this stuff about, my goodness, they're a non-Caucasian power, what should we do? I mean, I find that a bit off-putting, but I think, it's a matter of determining interests on both sides and recognizing that the era of sort of Western dominance is over, which doesn't mean to say the West in general, the United States in particular, isn't going to be a major power in the world. I believe it will be for centuries to come, but it's not the only one. And it doesn't get to unilaterally set the parameters of the discussion. There are other factors that need to be borne in mind. But I think on the Chinese side, there's a need to recognize that the sort of expansionist conception of nationalism, which they take, either economic or otherwise, which they take into some of these discussions, is outdated and old-fashioned and needs to be overcome. But you're not going to get there without a dialogue.
Jan Bhatia, let me come to you. You wrote in the Tribune the other day that having commanded the Sukna Corps, the recent face-off at Nakula in North Sikkim, reportedly leading to a scuffle and injuries to soldiers on both sides, came as a surprise to me. Now, tell us a little more about your experience in dealing with the PLA troops and officers while you were commanding the Sukna Corps. What are your impressions of these guys on the NSC?
That's a very interesting question. Having been on the line of actual control a couple of tenures, Nakula is different actually. You know, we never had the road to Bogotong sector. We built the road, so we have the access to the Nakula Pass now. So you see, it is infrastructure development. The moment you have access to roads, your face-offs will increase. Like I say, the PLA over the years invested in the 3 Rs: roads, radars, and reserves. So they could, they could come to wherever they wanted to come. We had to foot it out. We took a longer time reaching there. We didn't do the surveillance means. Now that we have the infrastructure development and we have the access, we have certain surveillance means. So that is why you'll find that the frequency of face-offs will increase. That is a given. And there's nothing to it. They have their own claim, we have our own claim, and we understand each other very well. And like Ambassador said, we are the last ordinance of October 1975. So we have maintained it very well, the peace and tranquility. So it is time-tested base. But the fact remains that this has the potential to spiral into a skirmish, into something bigger. In this particular, we're in the month of May now. May end is COVID-19, the uncertainty in the world. There are too many things which are happening. So we have to understand what are the strategic signals, if any, China is sending. Whether it's only at the operational, the military level, operational level, it's a tactical level, or is it more? As Ajay said from Beijing, then what could be the positive factors? What do we need to address? And like I said, India today is not going to blink. That China understands that. It has seen in the past. Dolam was one of them. We didn't blink at all. And they were a tactical disadvantage out there. We may be at a tactical, I would say, disadvantage. So we'll have to actually look at what do the Chinese really want? What next? We have to understand this is the part of the 3 warfare things, and they have a non-contact warfare. Are they looking at CPEC? Because in India, we have been talking, we've been actually, rightly so or wrongly so, I'm not getting into that. We were talking of integrating POK and Pakistan with us. We had Article 370 being evaluated. We had the map being issued in October end of Ladakh. So all these things have to be seen, put together, put in a the whole thing, and let's see what the Chinese aims are. That will be very important. It is not that if it is happening from Beijing, that is the premise. If it's not happening from Beijing, it's a tactical level. We'll resolve it.
Ajay, I have a rather conceptual sort of a question for you. While both India and China are nuclear weapon powers, China is conventionally far superior to India in terms of conventional weapons are concerned. Just like the India-Pakistan sort of equation, both are nuclear weapon powers, but one is conventionally more superior than the other. So what are India's options if China were to conventionally use its conventional military power against India in order to meet its territorial objectives? So given China's conventional military superiority, would India be forced to accommodate some of China's concerns, just like Pakistan may be forced to accommodate some of India's military objectives, given the conventional imbalance? Or do you think that's not an equation that would play out between India and China?
China and India have a sort of a glaring asymmetry in military power. I agree with you on that point. But that is not to also say that India has to take whatever is dished out by China lying down. I think that just as China has created local superiority in these areas where it has intruded, and it will be difficult for India to sort of physically sort of confront them and throw them out at these points, because China will, as China does, have made adequate provision for an aggressive Indian response. But there are many other options available to India for sort of generating pressure onto China. Nirupma has just given out a large range of diplomatic and sort of geostrategic options. But even beyond that, at the purely military level along the border, India can generate uncomfortable pinpricks for China. The Indian Ocean region is another area where the Navy is well poised for sort of action against China. But all of this is going to amount to sort of nothing unless it's backed by political will. If the government is not willing to confront China, and the belief at the strategic political level is that the cost India would have to pay is too high, and therefore we should seek accommodation rather than seek confrontation, then all your advantages come to naught. And that is something that China and many other countries in the region, notably Pakistan, count on. They count on the lack of political will to take the hard steps that are needed. So while I would be interested in hearing what General Bhatia has to say on this as a former DGMO, I'm of the belief that India can generate military pressure on China at select points of its own choosing. And all that stands between doing so and not doing so is political will. So I'm waiting to see what happens. Will this be resolved by sort of accommodation and seeking accommodation at all costs? There are many who say that the Modi government has got the attitude of a bully, that it can take on Pakistan, it can launch surgical strikes on Pakistan, but when it comes to China, it will sort of decide that accommodation suits its interests better. I'm not convinced of that argument. I'm waiting to see.
The Chinese thought process is always strategic. They never do tactical actions in isolation. So the strategic backdrop for the current happenings on the LAC is that the fundamental thing about China is China considers India to be its competitor. Not only in Asia, it considers that India will be a competitor tomorrow in the entire world. India will become a pole by itself.
Right.
So it wants to impose its hegemony on India. So it picks up the border dispute, which is, there right from 1950, and 70-year-old dispute. And because the borders are unsettled and the LAC demarcation has not taken place, China is in possession of our territory, and there is a asymmetry in the rival capabilities. China is far superior to us militarily.
That's right.
So it uses this weakness of ours or the ambiguity about the LAC to impose its hegemony on us. That is the strategic thought process of China.
That's
Now,
right.
part of this is all about our current international alignments, our approach to Pakistan, which is China's all-weather friend, our approach to the one belt, one road, one belt, one belt, one road.
That's right.
This thing phenomena, the fact that we have made claims to Baltistan, and even Home Minister has mentioned about Aksai-Chin.
Yeah.
So these things are all at the backdrop, if not to forget the Tibetans, who have got a government in exile in India, while the government of India says they are only guests here, given shelter But the fact is that there is a Tibetan government exile in India, and Dalai Lama is alive and very much in India at the moment. And China considers its periphery, both here as the Uyghurs, as a threat to itself. So now with this strategic backdrop, it uses the LAC. Now on the LAC also, there's a strategic, and that issue is rather on the boundary question, that China believes that sooner or later, if not today, then after 10 years, 15, 20, whatever time it takes, India will reassert its claim on the accession and all of the lost territories in as far as our, especially Ladakh is concerned.
Let me put it to you this way. Is the Chinese People's Liberation Army in possession of the land on the Indian side of the line of actual control, or which was traditionally considered to be the Indian side of the line of actual control at this point of time, or not? I know it's a blunt question, but I think it's for the viewers it may be useful for them to understand get a sense of the actual picture on the ground.
Yeah. So from what we know, and what we know is what we are seeing from various satellite imagery, etc. Because that is what gives you the most clear picture. And from that, at least in the north bank of Pengongso, it is clear that the Chinese are on what we consider our side of the line of actual control. So that much is clear. Now, I know this area was considered somewhat disputed between Finger 4 and Finger 8. And I'm sure your viewers will be familiar with both these terms because they've been talked about a lot. But there was a clear understanding on both sides that there will be no physical occupation of the area. So while patrols would come and they would go back, and our patrols would also go up to Finger 8 and come back, there was a very, very clear understanding nobody will physically occupy this area. And that's where I think the Chinese have come and they have sat in this area in what we consider our territory. That much is clear.
Right, but the government of India has been referring to mutual disengagement and mutual withdrawal from the Galwan area. So is that what is really taking place? Because it is my understanding, correct me generally if I'm wrong, that the Galwan has been in the Indian possession since 1962, Galwan area. So if it has been in the Indian possession, why do we refer to it as mutual disengagement and mutual withdrawal? The Chinese PLA has to withdraw, right?
My understanding of this is that while yes, the LAC in the Galwan area, I think there will be no dispute on either side as to where exactly it lies. But there were no real, I would say, posts which were very close to the LAC in that area, or that whole valley was physically occupied, by putting our troops there permanently. So we would go and patrol in that area, and then we would come back, and similarly the Chinese would come patrol and go back up to a mutually accepted point. Now, when two sides are physically sort of facing off each other, I don't know, Happymon, whether it's 1 kilometer our side or 2 kilometers our side, or is it all bang along the LAC. But the fact is, if you have hundreds of soldiers facing off each other, and if times are tense, then you could have incidents which go out of hand, which is exactly what has happened.
Mr. Jay, let's come to the signal in a bit, but just to sort of focus on this part of the argument that you made, which is what the Chinese have done is basically they have now in an unprecedented manner come into the claim area that they have had in the past, right? And that, so which means there is a claim line that India has, there is a claim that China have, and they sort of overlap in some ways. Now, at this point of time, in an unprecedented manner, they have come into their claim line, not just for patrolling, which they used to in the past, but also to build structures in their own claimed area.
Exactly. So when Mr. Modi said they have not come into Indian territory, he was reminding us that this is not a settled border. that there are claim areas, and the Chinese, by their definition, have not come into Indian territory. It can also be kind of, you could read it as an acceptance of the Chinese line, Chinese idea of the line as the border. Now, I think if one were to do that, the words are so few and so crisp, in a sense, typical Modi statement, that you could read several interpretations into them. And one of them has been that Modi has accepted the Chinese version of the border in this area. And what is more, having done that so happily or so suddenly and without fuss, he has opened the way to their changing that line whenever they want. Now, I think that the point is that I don't think that the second assumption is warranted. It is being used in India basically by the media to puff up the importance of this issue. I think to get more TRP ratings, to get more advertising revenues, etc. All the usual things go into it. And of course, it is based upon arousing the worst form of jingoistic patriotism in India. And that is what's going on this now.
Generally, you wrote in the national security strategy document that you had prepared that the rise of China and its growing assertiveness poses the most significant long-term challenge to India. An unsettled border provides China the opportunity for selective provocation at a time of their choosing. That seems to be very prophetic, what you wrote a few years ago. In fact, just 2 years ago. So how do you view this statement, looking at what's happening on the NSC at this point of time?
I think what has happened, Happymon, is that this whole coronavirus and this geopolitical churning that is happening has actually, in some ways, speeded up the India-China rivalry. So you find China becoming much more assertive in all the areas. You look at South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, Philippines, Indonesia, and also along the India-China border. So I think our biggest challenge going forward will be how are we going to manage the rise of both India and China peacefully. And I think it's going to be extremely, extremely challenging because China will not want a strong India in its neighbor, and it will do everything that it can to try and keep India engaged elsewhere or to keep India down. That's the reality. We might say it would be nice to have people of India and China living in peace and harmony going forward. I don't think it will happen. We will see great strategic competition.
But this is much more serious. And look at the backup forces. Tanks have been reported, guns have been deployed. There is a movement of regulars reported, precautionary movement elsewhere. We are mobilized in strength. And if we want to only rely upon diplomacy, what have we mobilized for? I mean, right. We must look at it this way. I think it's a very serious matter, and we must utilize this confrontation to have a, as I said, an arrangement of better border management by marking all these areas of differing perceptions, physically marking them, laying down absolute protocols, and which should be strictly adhered to. And then the joint working groups must meet, and they must demarcate the entire issue.
It is famously said that India and China have not fired a bullet at each other for a very, very long time now, despite tensions and differences. What has made this possible? What happens between the two sides that takes care of the fact that there is no firing? Like India and Pakistan, we keep shooting at each other all the time. So what has made it possible?
I think the burden of history in some ways, what we learned from 1962. And also I think Indian leadership through successive administrations has shown that sense of having learned from the past and made a genuine attempt to imbue this relationship with a sense of maturity. And by that I mean to open up the doors for dialogue with China, to be able to go like Rajiv Gandhi did all the way to Beijing, as it were. I think long ago it was, in one of the parliamentary debates, one of our prime ministers said you cannot march to Peking. You cannot march to Peking. If you can't march to Peking, at least, make an attempt to engage them, to talk to them, and to see how you can dial down, as you said, tensions, and create a structure for this relationship that is predicated on more confidence building, reduction of tensions, engagement across the board, across all of government, as it were. But where I think we have to do a lot more work is for China to study India a little more seriously.
And take it a little more seriously.
India much more seriously.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.